Number 12, such volunteering, be it helping at a local animal shelter, when they pick up litter, or working in a healthcare facility. Another example of a list, and I want to make sure that the elements in my list are parallel. So my list elements are helping at a local animal shelter, working at a healthcare facility, and so to be consistent, I need it to be picking up litter. That makes it parallel. So that's D. 13, we want to transition from the previous paragraph that highlights the criticism of compulsory volunteering mentioned in the previous paragraph. So what's going to highlight that criticism and transition? So the previous paragraph talks about the criticism of volunteering, or at least the criticism of compulsory volunteering, forcing people to volunteer, it is sort of a contradiction in terms, right? It's an oxymoron. Forced volunteering is not really a thing. As I say in the previous sentence, it misses the point of the act. So we want to emphasize that. And choice A is looking good. By its very definition, volunteer work is done willingly. It is emphasizing the contradiction, the paradoxical or oxymoronic nature of this, that no, it is not, you can't force volunteering. That doesn't really make sense. And that's what A emphasizes. Whatever the work may be, doesn't really do that for many students. Fortunately for communities in need, none of these emphasize that contrast, that contradiction. So we get A. 14, by requiring students to do community service in order to graduate, school officials are taking away students' choice. So apostrophes. I do not need an apostrophe here because there's no noun for officials to possess, so A is out. What about here? I do need to have a possessive noun because these students possess this choice, so I can get rid of B, but it's got to be plural students, multiple students choice, not just one student's. And so it needs to be S apostrophe to show that it's a plural number of students. So I get D. 15, proponents of compulsory volunteering who are in favor of it point out that. So right away I see this is redundant. If I call these people proponents, think of it as the opposite of an opponent. A proponent is a supporter. And so we don't need to say that they're in favor of it. That's defined in the word proponent. So I can just get rid of all of these basically and just go with C, nice and concise. Typically shorter is better because it's not going to be redundant, not going to be wordy. So here, proponents of compulsory volunteering point out that that's all we need. Choice C. In 16, we went another example similar to the examples already in the sentence. So let's see. Students who volunteer report increased self-esteem, better relationship building skills, and something positive. So increasingly busy schedules doesn't look good. A closer connection with their community seems to be the same kind of example. It's another positive benefit. Less time spent engaging in social activities, that's pretty bad. D is pretty bad. The only one that's positive is B, and that's consistent with the other two. 17, affect with an E versus affect with an A. So the key idea to remember is when you're looking for the verb form, which is what we are looking for here, it's with an A. So some studies have also found that students who do community service are more likely to volunteer as adults and thus affect society positively. So we can get rid of C and A. Now, is it going to be plural affect or singular affects? We're talking about students who do community service. That's our subject. They are more likely to volunteer and therefore affect. Choice B, plural verb. 18, word choice. One recent study by Sarah Helms, assistant professor, did focus specifically on mandatory volunteering. I mean, mandatory volunteering is pretty good. Coercive volunteering, a little too harsh. It's in the right direction in the sense that it's being forced, but coercive is way too negative. Forcible, same problem, just too negative. Imperative volunteering, not quite the right word. So the definition of the usage of that is not correct here. But mandatory works, right? Mandatory volunteering means you must do it. You're not being coerced. Coerced is sort of done under threat or under duress of some kind. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you could argue it's coercive if you're not going to be able to graduate if you're not volunteering. But nonetheless, the best choice here, the least harsh and the most precise is mandatory. Choice A. 19. She found that students who were required to volunteer rushed to complete their service hours in early high school, comma, they then did significantly less volunteer work. So we have here a comma splice, two complete sentences separated by just a comma. That's no good. Either of these, semicolons or periods, would be good here. The problem with B and C is they throw in these unnecessary commas. We can just continue the sentence as we did in the original, just swap out a semicolon for the comma, and everything is good because a semicolon separates two complete sentences. So we get D. 20 is a tricky comparison error question. So she found that students who were required to volunteer rushed to complete their service hours in early high school. They then did significantly less regular volunteer work in the 12th grade than what? So first, it's a comparison. Less of something than something. So I can get rid of D. When I have more than or less than, I want to use THAN. The key here is we are comparing what one group of students did to what another group of students did. So the students who were required to volunteer compared to those who were not required to volunteer, and what each of those groups did. And so the key word and the reason why B is right is this word did. Did shows that the comparison here, you can sort of see it in the first part, is what the forced group did, that they did less work than did the students who were not forced to required to volunteer. So that word did is sort of standing in to show that what you're comparing is the action, what one group did and what another group did. In A and C, you're comparing what a group did to hours. And that's not quite the right parallel comparison. You got to compare an action to an action, and that's what choice B does. 21, what's going to set up the point made in the next sentence? So instead of requiring students to volunteer, schools, blah, many student studies show that when schools simply tell students about opportunities, more students volunteer their own free will. So the sentence basically says, more or less, don't force them, but tell people, inform students about the opportunities, and they'll volunteer. So instead of requiring students to volunteer, schools have to recognize that not all students are equally well suited to the same activities. The next sentence is not about, making sure kids find the right activities for them. It's more about just telling students about the activities that are available and letting them, take their pick. B doesn't really mention that. How about C? Schools should focus on offering arrangements that make volunteering an easy and attractive choice. Exactly. So essentially what you want to do is sort of tell students what they can volunteer for and sort of make it easy for them to connect with the organizations and learn about the opportunities that exist. So if you put that structure in place, if you put those arrangements in place, you're going to make volunteering easier to do, more attractive to do. And so they're going to do it. And so C makes sense with what follows. D, that's not quite right because the next sentence is about influencing students. It's just doing it in a less required, or dare I say, coercive way. So the best answer here is C. 22, a conclusion that states the main claim of the passage. So let's see. It is imperative that schools do their part to find volunteers for many worthwhile organizations. Sure, we want people to volunteer, but the point of the passage is that requiring volunteering is not a good idea. And that's what we get in B. Schools that do this, in other words, what we saw in the previous sentence, will produce more engaged, enthusiastic volunteers than schools that require volunteer work. That's the core of this passage. Right? Don't require students to volunteer, but do other things to get them to volunteer willingly, and it'll be better for everybody. Studies in the fields of psychology and economics. Okay, this is just not what the passage is about, these studies. It is important that students choose charitable work that suits their interests and values. Again, probably a true statement, but not what the passage is about as a whole, right? We want to restate the main claim of the passage, and B fits better with that main claim.